Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Ichon, COO, and with me as always is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So Tim, there's a lot of hullabaloo about this proposed ballot initiative that's going to roll back, Prop 47. And for listeners to jog their memory, that's a 2014 law which reduced many crimes, such as penalties for crimes such as theft and drug possession, from a felony to a misdemeanor. And as a result of that, of course, significantly reduced the penalties for those crimes. So it's been a controversial law for over a decade now. And now, of course, given the rampant theft and drug trafficking and fentanyl, Newsom and the legislature are compelled to do something about all of this. So we have this comprehensive crime package that's coming down the pike from the legislature, and which Newsom said he will sign. The trouble is, you got these two potential laws coming down on parallel tracks. Obviously, there's going to be some inconsistencies with the two proposals, but I think it's more than that. I think it's even more intriguing than that. The speaker wouldn't be on a mission to take down the ballot initiative if there wasn't something underlying it. So, Tim, how about unpacking it for us?
So as kind of a 30,000-foot view, we've changed the law so that before, when you would get the several 100,000 signatures to place a measure on the ballot, you're on if you get enough signatures and they're verified. But we've changed the law in recent years to say, well, if you say you the proponents of the measure, and legislators come to agreement on a compromise measure, say, or if the proponents and opponents come to an agreement on something that negates the measure, you have, up to a certain date on the calendar to withdraw the measure from the ballot. And so that's what's going on here. There are several measures that have already qualified for the ballot, and they have until, I believe it's June 27th, to reach agreement on removing the measure from the ballot if they can get a deal. So obviously, this measure, they're very expensive, right? You spend millions of dollars to get the signatures, to get it on the ballot, and then you're going to have to spend millions, in some cases, tens of millions, to pass the measure. So you've seen that on this Prop 47 measure, which it wouldn't repeal it per se, it would roll back and reform some of the provisions, especially related to retail theft. So the retailers, Walmart and Target and others, have spent millions of dollars on the measure so far, and they've been joined by district attorneys across California. So what you've seen now is, as we've discussed on this podcast and as you've read in Steve Smith's various writings on these issues over the past year or so, the Assembly Public Safety Committee was really an albatross for Democrats in the legislature. They weren't listening to what the voters are saying. They were listening to what the kind of left-wing pressure groups were saying. And so they blocked bills on human trafficking, and they most recently they forced amendments on an anti-human trafficking bill that in many effects would neuter the bill. They blocked, kind of common sense bills about fentanyl abuse that had broad bipartisan support. And so one of the things that Speaker Rivas has done since coming in is he realized the terrible political dynamic on it. So he changed the chair of the Public Safety Committee, lowered the temperature a bit on some of these bills, and focused on things like Prop 47. So they have passed and kind of going through the process are several measures to address retail theft. And what we're seeing now with these negotiations is, can we reach agreement on these bills that would negate the ballot measure? The rub of it is this. There are provisions in Prop 47 that say if you amend these particular code sections, you have to go back to a vote of the people. And Democrats in the legislature just want to pass these laws, and they don't want to go back for a vote of the people, because for their kind of left-wing base, for radical groups, ACLU and some of these others pushing this, Prop 47 is like a religion to them. And so that's why you've seen Newsom and even Rivas and Senator McGuire, the new pro tem of the Senate, they will publicly say, we are opposed to doing anything to change Prop 47.
Yeah, let me ask you about this. I mean, are there serious differences between this proposed ballot initiative that will push back on Prop 47 versus the legislation coming down the pike? It's my understanding they're fairly similar. What's the political dynamic going on there?
Well, what the issue is that the legislation that's moving through would give police more authority and it would establish a new crime category targeting serial theft. And it would allow how much, remember right now, if you steal under $950, it's a misdemeanor. You basically get a ticket, a slap on the wrist. So it had some changes there, so you could aggregate those. If you have multiple incidents of theft over a 60-day period, you could aggregate those so it would be grand theft, which has stricter penalties. The issue is this, though, this issue of does it change Prop 47 or not? And that matters. And the legal interpretation matters. Because if the legislature passes a bill that changes Prop 47 and it effectively, and it doesn't go to a vote of the people, a court could invalidate it. So you could say, well, we did our bit, but the court struck it down. And then you're back to square one. So that's why prosecutors and most of the advocates are pushing the initiative, because for sure the voters will have had to approve it.
I see.
There's also a difference of intensity. Obviously, the measure with more teeth is the ballot initiative, not what the legislature's trying to do. So now you have a debate, right, and strategy of you could have the retailers who are largely funding the initiative saying, hey, we may want to cut this deal and declare a victory and go home. And you have the prosecutors, the California District Attorneys Association, are saying, hey, you've got to pass Prop 47, this initiative on Prop 47. It's not going to work the way the legislature wants it to do. So it's the controversy we've had now is in these negotiations that are going on, Democrats in the legislature are going to amend every one of these retail theft bills to say, if the ballot measure passes, all of the retail theft bills would sunset, meaning they would be wiped off the books, effective when the measure, if it's passed by the voters and if it takes effect. So what you're forcing kind of divisions between the main supporters of this measure. There may be some very good things in there that retailers have sought. However, it may not be everything that we want to do with Prop 47. And that's a real question, too, of, well, who ultimately makes the choice? It sounds like the DA's association are the lead proponents that would make the choice onto whether the ballot measure goes forward. So it's really if you look at it from the raw politics, if you don't want to amend Prop 47, it's kind of a clever way politically to do it. But it really, if you think you've been negotiating good faith and you've been getting some bipartisan agreement on this, kind of stinks. And it's engendering distrust. And so you're seeing the legislature's Republican leaders saying, this is one of the worst things. It shows you're really not serious about fixing these issues. You just want some window dressing. So we'll see who's gonna win out here. It's going to be an interesting next couple of weeks to see how they do it all. But certainly what started out as, kind of going around the legislature with a ballot initiative, the legislature certainly took back some of the power with this, if you call it, power play that they are undertaking this week. So we'll see what happens. My guess is, if you were to put a gun to my head and make me make a prediction, I feel like the district attorneys are going to stick to their guns and keep the measure on the ballot. Whether it divides them from their main financial supporters remains to be seen, but that's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they're going to win in the end, and I think it's a terrible precedent that people want to improve on Prop 47 or take back some of the measures, and they should have a right to do that.
That's right. That's exactly right. And where it makes a tough choice that's going to be have to be made soon is remember, voters have overwhelmingly approved Prop 47, and they've had the opportunity to make some of these kinds of reforms in past ballot measures since then, and they've been overwhelmingly rejected. So there's kind of a bet that because it's so in the news, it's so affecting people's lives. We see it almost every day that this is the environment that we could reform Prop 47. So we should press forward now, kind of strike while the iron's hot. But again, if you don't have a major financial benefactor bankrolling the initiative, those who support Prop 47 are going to spend a lot of money. And that could include Gavin Newsom opposing this initiative and spending money. Jerry Brown has been very active on Prop 47, and he still has millions of dollars left in his campaign account. So there's a lot of big money forces that could come in to try to fight this initiative. So it's really tough political choices have to be made pretty quickly.
Thanks for that, Tim. Very interesting. You want to introduce the next guest?
Yes, so if you think our politics are pretty wild here, well, you should look to our friends across the pond in the United Kingdom who have a major election coming up on, ironically, an important day for both of our countries, July 4th. And so we thought, what better person to have come on and explain to us what's going on with the UK elections than our friend Dr. Matt Beech, who's the director of the Center for British Politics at the University of Hull. He's also a senior fellow at the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. And we've had him as a guest before on our podcast talking about Brexit and those sorts of issues. And he's back to talk about the July 4th elections. And he goes through and explains kind of how we got here, to where, England is on the verge of making a major change in their who's controlling parliament. It looks like the ruling Conservative Party is going to suffer a major defeat as of this taping. So we talk about the major contenders and their platforms and what kind of prime minister Keir Starmer would be. He's the Labour leader if he's elected. How Brexit is impacting the vote, and what will it mean for the special relationship between the US and the UK, depending on who wins. So if you are interested in British politics, which I know many of you are, because we get a lot of interest when we've had our luncheons and podcasts in the past on UK politics, this is the podcast for you.
Thanks so much for listening, and here's Matt Beech.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted. Well, Matt, welcome back to Next Round Podcast.
Great to be with you, Tim.
Well, it's especially great. We love talking to you in any case, but it's especially great to have you on right now with all eyes focused on the general election. And I think, interestingly, on a meaningful date in the history of both of our countries, July 4th.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's just great how it's turned out on that day.
So the last time we talked with you a few years ago, Boris Johnson was riding high and the Conservative Party had a big majority in Parliament. Well, if you haven't been following it, things are kind of upside down since then, and things are quite different today as we head into this election. So bring our listeners up to speed. How did we get to a place where today, if you believe the polls, the Conservative Party is on the brink of a seemingly historic level defeat?
Really good question. Yeah, I'm sure your listeners would be keen to have some sense of an answer. Perhaps the most appropriate place to start is the fact that we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and Johnson was PM during the start of that and for most of that. And the lockdowns, what our American friends, your listeners call shelter in place, were very controversial. And we had three of them. They lasted a long time, and people couldn't see their loved ones, couldn't go to church, all that sort of stuff, couldn't go to work, damaging the economy. But there was a lot of sympathy around the first one of them because generally people were a bit worried and frightened. This was new and nothing to compare it to. But then we had subsequent lockdowns when children could go back to school in their classrooms, but people couldn't worship in their places of worship, at church, at temple, wherever. And then people couldn't really go into the office, but some places were open, and maybe you could go out and you could certainly go to the bar and have a drink outside, but other places weren't open, and there was a real sense of, are we in, are we out? But the thing that really damaged it for Johnson was he was found, as was his Chancellor, who is now our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to have breached and broken some of these regulations surrounding the Coronavirus Act and its regulations, and kind of fined by the police. And so there was this sense of rule breaking. There was a sense that this said something about Johnson's character, that while he was charismatic and a good campaigner, that he actually would just say anything to please people and he wouldn't abide by the laws. A sense that he was like a rule breaker, and he'd said very controversial comments, about certain groups of people whilst he was a journalist and sort of mayor of London in a previous sort of career. And so that just all added to the internal frustration within the parliament, much of the parliamentary Conservative Party, about Johnson and his behaviour and how that was being received in the media. And so eventually he resigned, and that was huge because he had been their election winner. He had won an 80-seat majority in December 2019, and that's a landslide. And it was, in one sense, it was looking like there was a form of electoral realignment amongst blue-collar north of England constituencies, where many traditional English men over the age of 45 perhaps had never voted Tory before, and had been Labour voters, went Tory. And they were talking about red wall seats, had been broken, and now the Tories had won the red wall, breached the red wall. And so then we had his replacement, Liz Truss. And Truss was voted in by the card-carrying Tory members in the country, not just a parliamentary party. And she was Prime Minister for about 40-odd days before she resigned in response to a budget that her and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, had put forward, which the markets reacted with great hostility towards because they thought it was a form of ill-thought-through kind of shock therapy. Again, now some people disagree with that and thought, no, that was the sort of stiff sort of medicine that was needed at the time. Under coronavirus and the lockdowns, the Tories had spent probably more money than any government had spent in generations, paying people to stay at home, paying people, giving grants to businesses, increasing welfare benefits, maybe for good reasons or not, depending on your perspective, but had spent tons of money. And simultaneously, like everyone else, we had very, very low levels of production and productivity because people were at home or under stiff legal restrictions about what they could do. And that put a massive degree of inflation in the global economy because there was not very many goods. And there was a high demand for them as we were coming out of that shelter-in-place lockdown situation. And that put a huge amount of inflation in the economy that then has only just started to sort of go away. Also, it wasn't aided by the fact that the war between Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that also added a massive degree of inflation in the European economy after COVID, particularly because Russia's the leading producer of fertilizer, and Ukraine and Russia produce huge amounts of grain. So in terms of, and energy, particularly for certain countries like Germany, who are highly dependent on Russian gas. So for sort of like energy and food production, huge increases to prices. So it was a really difficult time in second half to 2001, 2002, 2003 in Europe, financially, economically. So the Truss government undertook a very bold, he says in quotes, and courageous, some would say, economic budget, and the markets didn't wear it, and nor did the opinion polls were very, very hostile against it. And so Yeah, she resigned. She was forced to resign. And then we had Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Parliamentary Conservative Party, opted for Rishi Sunak, who the party had not voted for after Johnson's resignation, because they voted for Truss. And so, in a sense, you've got a guy who wasn't the first choice and also got into difficulty when he was Chancellor, you would call it a treasurer, under Johnson. So, and that's where we are. So the Tories have been really, since the Johnson debacle and then the Truss budget, losing support in the polls, losing support amongst conservative inclined voters, and simultaneously the Labour Party has been moving from the hard left back towards, on economic and defence and foreign policy issues, back towards the centre under Sir Keir Starmer, who has sought to get rid of the Labour left, the Jeremy Corbyn and his coterie of people from the Parliamentary Labour Party. So that's really the story, Tim.
Well, I feel like you could, I don't know, make a TV movie out of all of that. So the campaign has been now going on in full effect for a few weeks now, and I think we all would welcome these 6-week campaigns rather than, the months and months that we have to endure here in the United States. But maybe you could give our listeners a 30,000-foot view of kind of who are the key party leaders in the election and kind of what are they campaigning for? Maybe a few of the early dust-ups that we've seen on the campaign trail so far.
So we have, as most of your leaders will know, we have the Conservative Party and we have the Labour Party. The Labour Party is the centre-left Progressive Party. And the Conservative Party is led by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And he has called this election, it surprised many pundits. We thought it would be in the autumn, and he's gone in July. And the reason he's gone he's gone for the 4th of July. So the campaigning is now in June. And he's gone for it because the inflation levels have come down again to a very reasonable level. And also the Bank of England, which is our sort of national bank, is expected to cut interest rates at some point over the summer. And the economy is getting better and there's high degree of confidence. And so that's happened under his watch and under the Tories' watch. And so that he wants to capitalize on that. They've just had the Conservatives' disastrous local election results in May in England. I mean, disastrous, but they've lost so many seats. And so that's not necessarily going to tell you what people think about at a general election. But it's a very good indicator that people are getting fed up with the Conservatives for the reasons I've set out, and also because this party's been in power now for 14 years. So it's a long time. Yes, we've had many different prime ministers occupying different places on the political spectrum, absolutely different attitudes to the EU, in, some out, but nonetheless, it's the same party. And so that's really why he's called it now, and he's trying to say, look, don't wreck it with Labour. We're the more competent economic managers. Labour is led by Sir Keir Starmer. He's been the leader of the Labour Party, the official opposition, since 2020. And they are saying we are the party of change. The country needs a different direction. 14 years is too long. And the country faces big challenges. Well, 14 years is a long time for one party, and they are right. It does face significant challenges. Chief among them is the fact that we have huge levels of legal immigration, which most people in the country are not happy about. And that's been done under the Tories' watch. And so that's largely Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, because one of the reasons for leaving the EU was to reduce the amount of low skill and no skill migration from the EU. And certainly Johnson and the Tories got Britain out of the EU and did that. But they took from Peter to pay Paul. And what they did simultaneously was increase the amount of international migration. Now, that has always been higher than EU migration for many, many years, but increase the amount of it by reducing how much a sort of like high-skilled worker has to be paid by a company to bring them in from a different country. And so those high-skill roles really were rejigged and reclassified to be into relatively low-skill roles. And the amount of money you had to pay them went down significantly. And so you had a significant increase of immigration. It just was no longer EU migration. It was migration from around the rest of the world. But not only that, massive increase in international student numbers, because university bosses didn't make very much money out of COVID, because for approximately 2 years, lots of UK students stayed at home or maybe took a gap year or thought, I don't really want to take out student loans and have an experience where I'm just basically having to get teaching online. So what they did in the post-COVID years, university management significantly recruited at the master's level for international students. Why? Because they pay a lot of fees. And so these master's students have come from many different countries and they have brought their spouses and children with them. And again, that's entirely illegal, and many of them work hard in the local economy and contribute and what have you. But that's just put a significant strain on public services. And so a lot of people aren't very happy with that. And that's all the legal side of the immigration. The other huge thing we have are these small boats. We call them the small boats crossing the Atlantic, crossing the Channel, and in effect, they're trafficked people. Most of them form of modern day slavery. Some of them are economic kind of chances, but most people have paid money or bonds to criminals to get them across the channel, and they're coming from all sorts of countries, and it's incredibly heartbreaking, Tim. People regularly die in the channel. These small boats, these little ribs or these little kind of boats without board motors capsize in the channel, and people drown in these cold waters, and sometimes it's children and women. It's heartbreaking, but this is an issue that the Conservative government hasn't got a grip of, and so that is a huge issue. And so it's all in good, I think. A lot of people think Rishi Sunak saying, well, we brought inflation down, we're the economic managers you should be voting for. We're on this, they can't control our borders, they can't count people in and count people out. They can't do that. They've got the system's completely broken down. So Rishi Sunak has proposed an incredibly radical thing about processing people who are seeking asylum in Rwanda. So we're flying people to Rwanda, and because they want that to be a disincentive for people to come. So it's all rather extraordinary. And so I think Labour are saying, we're the party of change. Tory's been in 14 years, immigration's broke, and we'll do a better job funding public services. Now, that has led to other questions. Okay, so are you going to raise our taxes? Labour likes to raise taxes. It's got a good track record on that. Where's the money going to come from? So there are these issues, but they're way ahead in the polls. It's Labour's to lose. We also have a minor party, the Liberal Democrats. Generally, they're a centre-left, socially progressive party. They have a left wing, which is more kind of traditionally centre-left. They have an economic, more sort of right wing that's more kind of fiscally conservative. But at the moment, they're pretty centre-left. And they are in this sort of scenario, it's very difficult for them. They do better when there's a clear left wing from Labour and a clear more of a right perspective from the Conservatives. But when you've got two broadly centrist economic offerings and people are arguing about which party is the most competent public manager of public services and defence, then it's difficult for a third party.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So you kind of explained how we got here with, how the Conservatives are in, such a low standing today. What about Rishi Sunak? What are voters saying about him? Obviously, the party has their own woes, but what about him? Has he just not risen to the occasion? Is this kind of discussion of, change after 14 years just too overwhelming, on the natural, to expect that he might be in the running here to actually win? Is it something else about him or his team? What is, what's the verdict on him and kind of the government he's running and the campaign he's running so far?
Yeah, good question. Well, as I've just said, I think people think that he's a reasonably decent guy, and he's done quite well in terms of bringing inflation down, and that's not nothing. But he is in government, and he has overseen when he was chancellor this huge amounts of migration, and he's not got a handle on the small boats, on the illegal migration. Just hasn't got a handle on that, and the Rwanda policy to many people does seem a little bit strange. I mean, So I think really that's very difficult. We have these debates, prime ministerial debates, inspired by the US presidential debates, and they're not fixed. They're negotiated between the main leaders about how many debates and who would be in the debates, and whether you'd let minor party leaders be in the debates, and whether they're going to be on this network or that network. But in the first debate, in my opinion, Rishi Sunak last week had the best of the exchange between himself and Labour's Keir Starmer. But I think people generally think that he's a decent guy. He's not the most charismatic, but then people definitely do not think Keir Starmer is charismatic either. This is not the days of Tony Blair. This is not the days of Margaret Thatcher. These are two serious men who are interested and keen on policy detail, but they're not they don't have the charisma of Boris Johnson or the charisma of Nigel Farage to sort of, campaign and to sort of campaign in that kind of political poetry that you need.
So, in the backdrop of so many policy decisions in the UK still these days is Brexit. And you saw Boris Johnson and the Conservatives won in 2019 on the promise of getting Brexit done. Well, it's now kind of largely been done, but there's still frustration about the implementation, and there's still some unanswered questions, of course. So looking at things today, are UK voters, in your view, still as enthusiastic about it as they were when they voted to leave the European Union? And how do voters judge the job that has been done over the past 5 years, as the UK's been, negotiating the divorce settlement with Europe, so to speak?
Yeah, that's right. So that's right. Since Britain formally left, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, that was in end of January 2020. The real difficulty that has, in one level, has just been that, the immigration was brought under control from the EU, but completely given away. I wouldn't say lost control, because the government wantonly sort of gave it away. They intentionally increased the numbers of international migrants to huge levels, and so they succeeded in what they said, but then they did the exact opposite in a different sphere. And a lot of conservative inclined voters feel quite cheated about that. In terms of regaining parliamentary sovereignty, well, that has been achieved, and we don't have a foreign superintending court overseeing our decisions, and we don't pay, billions of pounds of membership fees to the EU, and we don't have decisions being made either by sort of bureaucrats in Brussels and the Commission, or in the European Parliament. Although I don't think it's fair to say that European Parliament is the most important institution in the EU. I still think that's the Commission. So I think in terms of regaining sovereignty, I think that's been done. I think that's a success. But most of my fellow Brits don't agree. Many of my fellow Brits have a real sense of bias of remorse now. But I'm a Eurosceptic, and I'm not a Eurosceptic like, say, some like Daniel Hannan, Lord Hannan, or others who felt we would have a kind of sort of like almost a libertarian type of economy success. For people like me who are more kind of constitutional conservatives, and it was an issue of sovereignty. It was about immigration and getting control and getting the numbers down of legal migration. And it was centrally about sovereignty, about having the 650 men and women that we elect to Parliament every 5 years. They should be sovereign, not a foreign superintending institution, even if it's a democratic institution, or its court. And the difference really is, whilst in the United States, people say, yeah, the people are sovereign, we the people. Yeah, you are in one sense, but the kind of real power, the power to act in that sense is really vested in a document in your constitution. Well, we have a constitution, but it's part written and it's uncodified. And the custodians of that are the 650 men and women we elect every 5 years, because they can change the practices of our constitutionality. So often I say to my students, really, that the document that's sovereign in the United States is the Constitution. The institution that's sovereign in the United Kingdom is Parliament, and that we weren't meaningfully sovereign whilst our sovereignty was so-called pooled with the EU institutions. Now, this is quite technical, but you either think sovereignty can be pooled or shared, or it can't. I came to the conclusion, and I did used to think it could be, but I came to the conclusion that sovereignty is really best understood like pregnancy. One is either pregnant or not pregnant. One is either one's country is either sovereign or it isn't. And when we were part of a federal polity, we were not meaningfully sovereign because we had to ultimately European Court of Justice decided things rather than the UK Supreme Court. EU law trumped British law, and we had to constantly think, what are other members of the club going to think if we do this policy or do that policy, if we try and pass this law or that law. Now, that's fine if you want to have that co-produced mutualist kind of federal polity. That's fine if that's the vision you want. And most countries in Europe want it for a lot of very sensible economic reasons. If you're a small, poorer country, or maybe for political reasons, and because you might want to have a close relationship to try to avoid conflict, or whatever. And that's what the European project was about, to stop a third European war and to fuse together the economies and the polities of Germany and France and their industrial base so closely together that there wouldn't be a third German war. But for most British people, that wasn't why Britain decided to join. It was purely about what we would then call the common market as economic opportunities. But the reason why most people voted to leave was not for the sort of the sunny uplands of a different model of economics. That was what some people, some Tories and some more libertarian inclined voted. But whether you're a sort of like small C conservative who votes Tory or votes Labour, it was really about saying that we wanted our parliamentarians to be sovereign.
Let's pick up a little bit on the discussion earlier about those working class voters that for the first time Boris Johnson won in 2019. 5 years later, after the stunning 2019 results, where are these voters leaning in the July 4th election? In your view, was it a one-off anomaly in 2019 from these voters, or is this a trend toward a more permanent political shift?
It didn't need to be a one-off. There was an opportunity. I think if Boris Johnson had governed in a different way and made different decisions about how he comported himself whilst in office, I think British politics would be in a very different position. But ifs, buts, and maybes, that's not the road that we've taken. So I think a lot of them will return to vote Labour because they'll think, oh, they've not been very well served by the Tories. But I think a lot of them will vote for Nigel Farage's Reform Party. So Nigel Farage has said that he's going to stand for a seat in Parliament in a seaside town called Clacton. He's now taken over the leadership of Reform. He was the honorary president. He's now the leader again. And this is a party that he set up. Before that, it was called the Brexit Party. And so it was initially set up as the Brexit Party to make sure the Tories got Brexit done, and they did. And at the last general election, he in effect stood down his candidates in a number of seats against the Tories so they would be able to get a majority, and they did. And then he spent more time in the United States, helping out and spending time with Donald Trump and that campaign, but also on a British TV channel, a conservative TV channel called GB News, which is very much modelled on the Fox News kind of model. But he's saying he's going to he wants to return and campaign in this election to be the Reform candidate for Clacton upon Sea. And if you look at the opinion polls, since he's announced that he's standing, and since he's done a switcheroo with a guy called Richard Tice, who was the leader of Reform, and now Farage is the leader, they are polling at about 18%, maybe even a bit more than that. And so I think it's very possible that and maybe even probable that they will split the centre-right and the right-wing vote. That would be very bad news for the Tories. It could well gift Labour a landslide. But also, I think a lot of those blue-collar, socially conservative, patriotic Northern English voters who voted Tory in 19, I think a fair chunk of them will go to Reform and vote for Farage.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment. But first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. So let's look ahead. If we believe the polls and we see a Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, emerge victorious on July 4th, what sorts of policy changes do you expect from a new Labour government, especially on things like the economy or immigration, as we've discussed? And what type of a leader do you expect he will be as Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I don't really know, to be honest, because you campaign in poetry, govern in prose. And I think what Labour will find is that they don't have an awful lot of fiscal wiggle room. If they want to spend more on public services, they are going to have to put taxes up. Yep. What else? They are going to have to try to get to grips with the immigration system, but they're going to abandon the Rwanda policy. But how they get to grips with it, I don't know. I mean, he's talking about some kind of border force. We'll wait and see. Again, that will cost money. We'll wait and see how long that takes to be set up. So it's kind of hard to see. What I think is clear. I don't think there are concerns about a Keir Starmer prime ministership regarding NATO, regarding the transatlantic alliance with the United States, regarding defense of the realm, or regarding foreign policy. I think on those questions, he's very much in the normal custom and practice of British politics. He's not like when Jeremy Corbyn was the Labour leader in 2017 or 2019 and could have become primus inter pares, first among equals, the monarch's first minister, and people were generally thinking, my gosh, what's that going to mean for defence? What's that going to mean for nuclear deterrence? What's that going to mean for NATO? What's going to mean for a partnership with the United States? And all of those questions, Keir Starmer is I don't know how I would put it. I'd probably just put it. He's just like a regular mainstream politician. But on other questions, I don't know. He's very socially progressive. I think I would probably say he's very woke on a number of issues. During the BLM protests and things like that, he famously took the knee. During the whole debate around trans rights, he said to Andrew Marr, one of the most important BBC journalists, that it was wrong for people to say that only women have cervixes. He has since kind of rode back on that. And he has flip-flopped on a lot of questions. You have to really watch this man. He seems to give very kind of interesting answers in different scenarios to different audiences. But I think a lot of people would say he's very sort of like London Labour. Most charitable way I'd say it is he's socially progressive, but I would say he's pretty woke and in that sense pretty illiberal in the classical sense of sort of liberalism. So, but on issues of foreign and defence, I think he's sensible and he's in the traditions, in the sort of the centrist traditions of British politics and diplomacy.
So another, to me, really fascinating issue is the union itself, and it seems like it's a growingly contentious issue. You saw the independence referendum in Scotland not too long ago. You saw the victory of Sinn Féin in the last Northern Ireland election. How do you see a Prime Minister Starmer handling these issues in the coming years? And do you think we're more or less likely to see these renewed pushes for Scottish independence or Irish reunification with the Prime Minister Starmer?
I'm not sure Starmer is going to be the kind of the change agent for that. I mean, it's certainly true that the union is weaker than it was before devolution in the late 1990s. That devolution has weakened the argument, weakened the idea of the union by definition that you have a asymmetric polity now. You have no parliament in England, you have a UK parliament in London, and you in effect have polities in Belfast, Edinburgh, and Cardiff. And so that in and of itself has an internal energy where you've got elected representatives and budgets and differentiated policy agendas. So much of the British policy is devolved to these various legislatures. So yeah. But what I don't think I think Starmer certainly at a rhetorical level is a unionist and wouldn't want to see Scotland go. The SNP are in a weak position. They've had scandal after scandal. Nicola Sturgeon has resigned. Husband has been under investigation. She's been under investigation. The police have been involved about questions about funding and financing of the party, all sorts of things. Education and health have been run very poorly by the SNP. I mean, don't forget the SNP have been in power longer than the Conservatives have been in power in the UK Parliament. The SNP have been in power since 2007, so they have run the table for pretty much a generation. So yeah, there's also the whole notion of time for a change in Scotland. I think Labour are licking their lips and rubbing their hands, thinking it's a real time to sort of take back Scotland. So I think Labour will probably, I don't know, it's very hard to predict, but I think they might have a reasonable night on the 4th of July in Scotland in terms of winning seats. So I don't want to say that the SNP are a busted flush, because I don't think they are, but they are. They've been scandalised. They've not been, in my opinion, competent managers of public services or of the economy, and they're looking much weaker than they were a few years ago. In Wales, the Labour First Minister Vaughan Gething has just lost the motion of no confidence. Labour has really bossed politics in the devolved Welsh Assembly. I don't think that's going to mark the end of Labour dominance in Wales, but maybe just that administration. In Northern Ireland, obviously, it's very different because, as you quite rightly say, Sinn Féin are now the party of great strength in the Northern Irish Assembly, and that does change things significantly in terms of the longer term prospects of a united Ireland.
So you mentioned earlier you thought we don't have anything to fear that the special relationship between the US and the UK might change under a Prime Minister Starmer. But here's an interesting one for your crystal ball. How do you think a Prime Minister Starmer would approach the potential return of a President Donald Trump in 2025?
Well, that is interesting. I mean, obviously, for Starmer especially, and for Labour, having being able to break bread with the Democrats is instinctive and would be much preferable than dealing with President Trump, and let alone the Republican Party. But perhaps the Make America Great, the Trump sort of wing of the Republican Party, would be much more difficult and require much greater diplomacy from Starmer. But I think that can be done because the special relationship, the transatlantic alliance, whilst it's very important, is much more important to the United Kingdom. United States is still the indispensable world nation. It's still the leader of the free world. It's still, the country with the greatest sort of like economic might in the free world and military might. So, I mean, United States does need Britain particularly to be, the kind of the bedrock European partner in NATO, and often throughout post-war history when the Allies have wanted to do international interventions. But generally speaking, it's a very one-sided relationship in that the United Kingdom needs the United States much more than the United States needs the UK. So I think there would have to be a high degree of pragmatism, but by the Starmer government, where they disagreed, and of course they will disagree, with the Trump presidency on a range of issues, but they will disagree with a Biden presidency because Britain and the United States economic interests are often not the same.
So as we close, if we believe the polls and the Conservative Party faces a pretty historic defeat, we certainly in the United States, there's nothing more entertaining for political observers than to sit back and watch the infighting that takes place in one party or another after a big defeat. So where do you see the Conservative Party going after the election if we believe the polls and they get a pretty bad defeat? What course do you see them potentially charting? This could be a loss that could be more than one election to come back from, and who are some of the people that we might see trying to lead the comeback and pick up the pieces?
Yes, well, my friends, I joke with my friends that whilst I'm a political scientist and historian, I'm shockingly bad at judging election outcomes. I don't have a very good track record, but you've asked me. And so I think that Labour will win and win comfortably. And I think it'll be very hard for the Conservatives I'm sure Rishi Sunak will resign if it's a big defeat, as is the way that with British, generally speaking, with British leaders, if the Prime Minister loses big, they resign. And then there'll be a leadership election. I know that Nigel Farage is saying that he called his party Reform because he wanted to reform the right and the centre right. So who knows what will happen to Reform if they do well, whether they stay as Reform or whether he comes back into the Conservative Party, because many years ago he was a card-carrying member, or whether he says no, Reform is then now the vehicle of the right and the centre right. So I don't know, but it's fascinating, and I'm sure your listeners, my American friends, will be avidly watching. But it is going to be quite a significant election.
Well, we just scratched the surface of it, but I think you're in for an interesting month or so before July 4th. Matt, thanks again for joining us. And for our listeners who want to follow kind of your writings and what you're doing and saying on the election in the coming weeks, how can they look you up and keep track of what you're publishing and your interviews in the coming week?
Probably the easiest way is on Twitter, or X, as we should call it these days. And my research centre is the Centre for British Politics, and hashtag at CBP Hull. That's HULL, CBP Hull, and you'll be able to find all the stuff we're doing.
Great. Thanks so much again.
Thanks, Tim.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.